I never believed in ghosts. Not until the Arctic took half my team and left me with memories that crack through my sleep like ice splitting under pressure. My name is Thomas Whitmore, and in the winter of 1934, I led a joint British-Norwegian expedition into the frozen hell north of Svalbard. We were supposed to be mapping uncharted territories, documenting glacial formations, collecting data that would cement our names in the journals of the Royal Geographical Society. Instead, we documented something that should have stayed buried under 1,000 feet of ice and silence. The team assembled in Tromsø during the last week of October. There were 8 of us initially. Erik Nordström, our Norwegian guide, had survived 3 previous Arctic expeditions and carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who understood the ice. His brother Lars handled our sled dogs, 12 Greenland huskies that could pull through conditions that would kill a man in minutes. Dr. Margaret Ashford served as our expedition medic and biologist, one of the few women the Society had reluctantly approved for fieldwork. James Crawford, our photographer, had documented expeditions across 4 continents. McKenzie and David Fletcher were surveyors, tasked with creating accurate maps of the regions we traversed. And then there was Father Patrick O'Connor, a Catholic priest with a peculiar interest in Arctic folklore, whose inclusion I had questioned, but couldn't deny given his financial backing of our venture. We departed Tromsø on November 2nd aboard a reinforced vessel that pushed through early ice formations like a knife through frozen butter. The darkness had already descended on the Arctic, that months-long night that transforms the region into something alien and hostile. Our destination was an unmapped glacier system approximately 400 kilometers northeast of Svalbard, an area where Norwegian whalers had reported unusual magnetic disturbances and atmospheric phenomena that interfered with their navigation equipment. The ship dropped us at the ice edge on November 7th, and we watched it disappear into the polar darkness, its lights fading like dying stars. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of quiet that presses against your eardrums and makes you hear your own heartbeat amplified through bone. Erik assembled the sleds with practiced efficiency while Lars calmed the dogs, who seemed unusually agitated, pulling at their traces and whining in a register I'd never heard from working animals before. We made good progress the first 3 days. The ice was stable, the weather clear enough to navigate by starlight, and the occasional shimmer of aurora that painted the sky in shades of green and violet. Our equipment functioned perfectly. The surveying work proceeded according to schedule. I recorded observations in my journal every evening, noting temperatures, ice conditions, distances covered. Everything by the book. Everything professional and scientific and rational. On the 4th night, Margaret woke me at 3 in the morning. I could see her breath crystallizing in the tent, tiny ice particles glittering in the lamplight. Her face was pale, her eyes wide in a way that immediately pulled me from sleep into full alertness. "Listen," she whispered. I held my breath and listened to the Arctic night. For a moment, there was nothing but the usual sounds: wind brushing across ice, the occasional crack of thermal contraction, the soft breathing of James in his sleeping bag across the tent. Then I heard it, a sound that made every hair on my body stand rigid. It was a scream, but not quite. It vibrated through the ice itself, resonating up through our tent floor, through our bones, a frequency that felt like it was coming from inside my own skull. It lasted perhaps 10 seconds, rising and falling in pitch, before fading into silence that felt even more oppressive than the sound itself. "What in God's name was that?" I breathed. Margaret shook her head. Her hand was trembling as she adjusted her fur hood. "I've been awake for an hour. That's the 4th time I've heard it. Each one seems closer than the last." We woke the others. Erik's face remained impassive as he listened to our description, but I noticed his hand instinctively move to the rifle prop beside his sleeping bag. Father O'Connor clutched a crucifix he wore beneath his parka, his lips moving in silent prayer. Crawford wanted to set up his camera equipment, his scientific curiosity overriding his obvious fear. The surveyors exchanged glances but said nothing, though I could see the question in their eyes. Should we turn back? We didn't hear the sound again that night. As dawn approached, or rather, as the darkness shifted from absolute black to deep blue twilight, Lars went to check on the dogs. I heard him shout, a sharp bark of alarm that brought all of us stumbling from our tents into the -40 cold. The dogs were in chaos, tangled in their traces, several of them bleeding from torn pads where they'd fought to break free. But what stopped my heart was what Lars stood staring at: tracks in the snow surrounding our camp. They formed a complete circle about 50 meters in diameter, as if something had walked around us repeatedly during the night. The tracks were roughly humanoid but wrong. Too long in the foot, too narrow, and spaced with a stride length that suggested something either impossibly tall or moving in a manner that defied normal human locomotion. Erik knelt beside one of the prints, measuring it with his gloved hand. His weathered face had gone pale beneath his beard. 20 years I've worked this ice, he said quietly. Never seen anything like this. Not polar bear, not walrus, not human. He looked up at me, and I saw something I'd never expected to see in those experienced eyes: fear. We should turn back, Thomas. Right now. I should have listened to Erik. That's the thought that haunts me most. A good leader weighs the counsel of his experienced team members, especially when they're warning of danger. But I was 30, 2 years old and hungry for achievement, desperate to return to London with something significant. Something that would elevate my career beyond the minor expeditions and provincial lectures that had defined it so far. So I made the decision that would kill 4 people and shatter the others. We'll continue, I said, but we increase security measures. 2-person watch rotations through the night. Rifles always loaded and accessible. No one goes anywhere alone, not even to relieve themselves. We document everything, including these tracks. Crawford, I want photographs of every unusual thing we encounter. I could see the relief on some faces, the disappointment on others. Margaret looked at me with something like pity, as if she could already see how this would end. But no one openly challenged my decision. We were British, after all, and Norwegian. Cultures that prize stoicism and completion of duty above personal comfort or even safety. We broke camp and continued north. The tracks paralleled our route for the entire day, always staying just at the edge of visibility, about 100 meters to our east. Whenever we stopped, they stopped. Whenever we moved, they moved. It was like being shadowed by something that wanted us to know it was there, that wasn't bothering to hide its presence. The psychological effect was devastating. Even Lars, usually calm and focused, began snapping at the dogs, his patience eroded by constant vigilance. The ice changed as we progressed deeper into uncharted territory. The glacier formations became increasingly bizarre, twisted into shapes that seemed almost architectural. Towers of ice jutted 30 meters into the air, carved by wind into forms that resembled Gothic spires or skeletal fingers reaching toward the black sky. Crevasses opened like wounds in the ice, their depths lost in darkness so absolute that our electric torches couldn't penetrate more than a few meters down. Father O'Connor became increasingly agitated. He muttered prayers constantly, clutching his crucifix until his knuckles showed white through his gloves. On our 7th night, he pulled me aside during my watch rotation. "This place is cursed," he said bluntly. His Irish accent had thickened with stress. "There are stories, old stories from the Norse explorers. They spoke of things that lived in the ice, creatures that were neither living nor dead, spirits trapped between worlds. The Iskister, ice ghosts. They called them the Wraiths of the frozen waste." I tried to maintain my scientific composure. "Father, these are just folk tales, superstitions born from isolation and darkness." "Are they?" He grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "Then explain the tracks. Explain the sounds. Explain why every dog in our team is terrified. Why they fight to pull away from this direction every time Lars tries to move them forward." "Animals know, Thomas. They sense things our civilized minds have trained us to ignore." Before I could respond, the screaming started again. But this time it was different. This time there were multiple sources, coming from different directions surrounding us. The sound vibrated through the ice with such intensity that I could feel my teeth rattling in my skull. It rose and fell in waves, almost like speech but in no language spoken by human tongues. The dogs went absolutely insane, howling and tearing at their traces with such violence that 3 of them broke free and ran into the darkness before Lars could secure them. "Everyone up," Erik shouted, though no one in camp could have possibly remained asleep. "Defensive positions! Rifles ready!" We formed a circle around our tents, 8 people with 5 rifles between us, staring into absolute darkness illuminated only by our electric torches and the faint green glow of aurora overhead. The screaming continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then it stopped with shocking suddenness, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. "There," Crawford whispered, pointing into the darkness to our north. I followed his gesture and felt my blood turn to ice in my veins. Shapes were emerging from the storm, white against white, barely visible even with our torches trained on them. They moved wrong, Their gait neither human nor animal, but something in between, something that hurt to watch because it defied the basic biomechanics my mind insisted should apply to anything moving on two legs. There were at least a dozen of them, possibly more. They maintained a distance of about 50 meters, just at the edge of our torchlight, moving in a circle around our camp with that same unsettling stride. I couldn't make out details, just impressions: tall, thin, moving with joints that seemed to bend in too many places, or in the wrong directions entirely. Margaret had her binoculars up, though how she could see anything in this darkness I didn't know. Her voice shook when she spoke. They're watching us. God help me, I can see their eyes. They're reflecting our torchlight like animal eyes, but they're positioned wrong, too high on the head, too far apart. Fletcher said suddenly, his voice cracking with panic, "For God's sake, shoot them." Erik didn't move, his rifle remaining pointed but not firing. "Save your ammunition. We don't know if bullets will even affect them. And if shooting provokes them." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. We all understood the implicit calculation. 8 humans with limited ammunition versus an unknown number of unknown entities on their home territory, hundreds of kilometers from any help. We stood there until dawn, such as it was, the darkness lightening fractionally to a deep blue twilight. The shapes retreated as the light grew, fading back into the storm like they'd never existed. But the tracks they left were real enough. Hundreds of them now, crisscrossing around our camp, some pressed so deep into the ice they must have been made by something incredibly heavy despite the apparently thin frames we'd glimpsed. We turned back, Erik said flatly. It wasn't a suggestion. Now. This morning. We abandoned the survey and returned to the coast. This time I didn't argue. Turning back should have been simple. We'd marked our route carefully, left ranging poles every kilometer, documented our path with surveying equipment that would have made retracing our steps straightforward even in total darkness. But the Arctic had other plans. The storm that had been threatening for days finally hit just as we began breaking camp, and it hit with a violence that seemed almost purposeful, almost directed. Within minutes, visibility dropped to less than 3 meters. The wind screamed across the ice with such force it knocked David Fletcher off his feet and would have carried him away if McKenzie hadn't grabbed his parka. Snow didn't fall so much as fly horizontally, each flake striking exposed skin like a tiny knife. The temperature plummeted from -40 to something that made our thermometer useless, the mercury retreating to the bottom of the tube and staying there. "We can't travel in this," I shouted over the wind, my words barely audible even to myself. "We have to shelter until it passes." Erik shook his head violently, pointing back the way we'd come. "If we stop, we freeze! The tents won't survive this wind. We have to keep moving. Find some kind of terrain feature that can provide windbreak." So we moved into that hell, strung together by rope like mountaineers, each person barely able to see the one in front of them. The dogs pulled with desperate strength, perhaps understanding better than we did how critical movement was to survival. Lars was in the lead, following some instinct that went beyond navigation, beyond sight, trusting his Arctic-born senses to find salvation. I was fourth in line, between Margaret ahead of me and Father O'Connor behind. Every step was a battle against wind trying to knock me flat, against cold seeping through my layers, despite the specialized gear that was supposed to protect to -60. My face felt like it was being flayed, ice crystals building up around my goggles until I was navigating blind, relying entirely on the rope connecting me to Margaret. That's when O'Connor started screaming. I turned, fighting the wind, and saw him pointing wildly to our left. I couldn't see what had alarmed him, couldn't see anything through the white chaos of the storm. But then I felt it a presence, something massive and cold even by Arctic standards, moving parallel to our line. I couldn't see it clearly, just glimpses of white movement in white storm, shapes that were too tall, too thin, moving too smoothly through conditions that were killing us. "They're hurting us?" O'Connor screamed. "Can't you see? They're driving us somewhere." Margaret turned back, saw what we were seeing, and her face went pale. She shouted something to James ahead of her, who passed the message forward. I felt the rope jerk as our line changed direction, Lars trying to angle away from whatever was shadowing us. But everywhere we turned, there were more shapes, more movements in the storm, always at the periphery of vision, always just barely visible. We traveled like that for hours, though time lost all meaning in that frozen hell. My world contracted to the rope in my hands, the back of Margaret's parka ahead of me, the burning in my lungs from breathing air so cold it felt like inhaling ground glass. Several times I felt certain I would simply stop, let the rope slip from my frozen fingers, lie down in the snow and let the cold take me. Each time, the rope would jerk forward. Margaret's continued movement pulling me onward despite my mind screaming that stopping would be easier, warmer, peaceful. I don't know who saw it first, probably Lars, but suddenly we were stumbling into shelter. An ice cave, or more accurately a crevasse that had formed a roof, creating a cavern about 20 meters deep and 10 meters wide. We collapsed inside, too exhausted even to properly secure the dogs, just falling into heaps of frozen human form while the storm raged outside our shelter. I don't remember falling asleep. I remember Margaret working on Fletcher, who had severe frostbite on 3 fingers of his left hand. I remember Lars counting dogs and coming up short. We'd lost 2 more in the storm. I remember Father O'Connor praying in Latin, his voice hoarse from screaming. Then darkness took me, exhaustion overriding even fear. I woke to silence. Not just quiet, but absolute silence. The kind that feels unnatural wrong. My first panicked thought was that I'd gone deaf from the cold, but then I heard my own breathing, heard the crackle of frost on my sleeping bag. I sat up, every muscle screaming in protest, and looked around our shelter. The storm had passed. Through the cave entrance, I could see stars impossibly bright, and the green-gold shimmer of aurora painting the sky. Inside the cave, our electric torches cast harsh shadows. Everyone was accounted for, sleeping in various positions of exhaustion. The dogs were curled together for warmth, quiet for the first time in days. But something was wrong. I felt it before I understood it. Some primitive part of my brain screaming warnings that my rational mind struggled to interpret. I stood slowly, careful not to wake the others, and moved toward the cave entrance. My breath crystallized in the torchlight, tiny ice particles glittering as they fell. That's when I saw them, standing in a semicircle about 30 meters from our cave entrance, perfectly still, watching. In the clearer air, with aurora light and starlight to supplement my torch, I could finally see them clearly. And I wish to God I couldn't. They were roughly humanoid, about 8 feet tall, but wrong in every detail. Their bodies were corpse, white, reflecting light with a quality that reminded me of deep ice, not skin. They were impossibly thin, skeletal, as if something had taken a human form and stretched it vertically until it became a grotesque parody. Their limbs were too long, with too many joints, bending in ways that made my stomach lurch. But it was their faces that destroyed something in my mind. They had faces, or at least the suggestion of faces, but everything was wrong. Eyes too large, too high on the skull, reflecting our light with a blue-white shine. No nose, just 2 vertical slits. Mouths that seemed to extend too far across their faces, sealed shut but somehow suggesting they could open to impossible widths. They didn't move. Just stood there watching with those terrible eyes that caught the aurora light and reflected it back in shades of blue and white that hurt to look at. I stood frozen in the cave entrance, my torch trembling in my hand, every instinct screaming at me to run, while my rational mind insisted that running would trigger a predator response, that standing still was survival. I don't know how long I stood there. Time lost meaning under that terrible gaze. It might have been minutes or hours. Then Erik was beside me, appearing so silently I nearly screamed. His rifle was in his hands, but he didn't raise it, didn't aim. Just held it across his chest while he stared at the creatures surrounding us. "Isgaster," he whispered, so quietly I almost didn't hear him. My grandfather told stories. I thought they were just tales to frighten children. He said they were men once, explorers who went too deep into the ice, who stayed too long in the darkness. The Arctic claimed them, transformed them, made them part of itself. Neither living nor dead, neither human nor animal, just ice given hunger and purpose. What do they want? My voice cracked on the words. Same thing the ice wants. To keep people away. To protect what's theirs. Erik's jaw clenched. We're not leaving here, Thomas. Not all of us. Maybe not any of us. They've been playing with us, hurting us, wearing us down. Now we're exhausted, low on fuel, lost. Now they're ready. Behind us, the others were waking. I heard Margaret gasp, heard Crawford fumbling for his camera with hands that shook so badly he dropped it twice. Father O'Connor began praying loudly, his voice rising in Latin that echoed off the ice walls. The dogs started their awful whining again, pressing against the back of the cave as far from the entrance as they could get. "We have to try," I said. "We have to fight our way out." Erik looked at me with something like pity. "With what? 5 rifles? Against how many of them? Look at them, Thomas. Really look. How do you kill something that might already be dead? How do you fight the ice itself? But we had to try. I knew that even as despair settled into my bones colder than any Arctic wind. We hadn't come all this way, survived all this just to huddle in a cave waiting for death. I moved back into the shelter and began rousing everyone fully, explaining what stood outside, watching the horror dawn on their faces as they understood our situation. McKenzie wanted to fight. Fletcher wanted to try negotiating, as if those things understood human speech or cared about human concepts like parley. Margaret checked her medical supplies with shaking hands, perhaps understanding she'd need them soon. Crawford, God help him, kept trying to photograph the creatures through the cave entrance, his scientific mind still functioning even as his hands trembled with terror. Lars focused on the dogs, checking their harnesses, preparing them for what might be our last desperate run. Father O'Connor alone seemed to have found peace. He blessed each of us in turn, making the sign of the cross on our foreheads with hands that had stopped shaking. When he reached me, he looked into my eyes with terrible certainty. "This is my fault," he said quietly. "I pushed for this expedition. I knew the stories. I wanted to prove they were real, to document something beyond human understanding. I brought us here. We all chose to come," I replied, though his words struck something in me. "We all knew the risks. Did we?" His smile was bitter. Did we really understand what we were risking? Our lives, yes, but also our souls, our sanity, our understanding of what's possible in this world. Look at them, Thomas. Some knowledge should stay buried. The creatures began moving then, not toward us but around the cave, extending their semicircle to a full circle. They moved with that same disturbing gait. Joints bending wrong, too smooth for the broken ice terrain. There were at least 20 of them now, maybe more. They'd been gathering while we huddled in our shelter, assembling their forces, preparing for something. "They're gonna rush us," Erik said flatly. "Everyone with a rifle form a line at the cave entrance. Everyone else, get behind us. Lars, keep the dogs ready. When they come, we'll fire a volley, try to break their line. Then we run. Don't stop for anyone or anything. Head south by compass. If you get separated, keep going south. If you make it to the coast, tell them what happened here. We took our positions. I held my rifle with hands I willed to steadiness. Margaret stood beside me, her face pale but determined. On my other side, McKenzie breathed in short, sharp gasps, his frostbitten fingers struggling to grip his weapon. Behind us, I could hear Father O'Connor's prayers, a constant Latin murmur that was somehow comforting despite the words being incomprehensible to me. The creatures stopped moving. For a moment, everything was perfectly still. Even the aurora seemed to freeze in the sky, bands of green and gold suspended over our heads like a painted ceiling. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and fast, pumping blood through veins that felt like they were filled with ice water. Then they screamed. Not like before, when the sound had been almost questioning, almost exploratory. This was rage and hunger and something else I had no words for, something that resonated in frequencies humans weren't meant to hear. It vibrated through the ice, through our shelter, through our bodies. I felt my teeth crack, tasted blood in my mouth. Beside me, Margaret dropped to her knees, hands pressed against her ears, blood leaking from her nose. They came with the scream, moving with impossible speed across the ice. In that moment, I understood Erik's question about how to kill something that might already be dead. They moved like they had no regard for their bodies, no sense of self-preservation. One of them fell into a crevasse and didn't even slow the others. They just kept coming, those terrible faces growing larger, those eyes reflecting our torchlight back at us. We fired. 5 rifles releasing their rounds simultaneously, the sound flat and muffled in the Arctic air. I saw 3 of the creatures jerk as bullets struck them, but they didn't fall. They barely even slowed. Black fluid leaked from their wounds, freezing immediately into crystals that shattered and fell like dark snow. Whatever they were, bullets weren't enough. Again, Erik shouted, working his bolt action with practiced speed. "Aim for the heads. Aim for anything that looks vital." We fired again. This time one of them went down, its head snapping back from a shot that must have struck something critical even in their alien anatomy. But the others just stepped over it, flowed around it like water around a stone, closing the distance. 20 meters now. 15. Erik screamed.
"Lars, get the dogs moving! Everyone else follow the sleds! Run!"
We ran, stumbled out of the cave and into the Arctic night, abandoning our supplies, our equipment, everything that might slow us down. Lars had the dogs moving, the sled lurching forward across uneven ice. I grabbed onto the back of it, Felt others doing the same, felt the terrible strain as the animals pulled human weight they weren't meant to carry. Behind us, I could hear them coming. Their screams had changed again, higher pitched now, almost excited. The sound of hunters who know their prey is running, who can smell the fear and exhaustion. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. They were gaining, moving faster than should have been possible across terrain that required us to watch every step. They didn't stumble, didn't slip, didn't show any difficulty with ice that was broken and treacherous. They just came, relentless as glaciers, inevitable as winter. Fletcher fell. One moment he was beside me, clinging to the sled, the next he was gone. I heard his scream, thin and high, cut off abruptly. I started to turn back, but Erik grabbed my arm with iron strength.
You can't help him.
Keep moving. Father O'Connor was praying loudly now, his words coming in gasps as he struggled to keep up. Margaret had her medical bag somehow, still clutching it despite everything. Crawford had lost his camera but was fumbling with something in his coat. A journal, I realized. Even now, even in full flight, he was trying to document what was happening. We ran for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. My lungs burned. My legs screamed. The cold was a knife in my chest with every breath. The sled dogs were flagging, their pace slowing despite Lars's desperate commands. We couldn't maintain this pace. We were going to die out here, chased down like animals, torn apart by creatures that shouldn't exist. Then McKenzie screamed. I turned in time to see one of them grab him, those two, long arms wrapping around his chest, that terrible face lowering toward his. He fired his rifle point blank into its torso. The creature didn't even flinch. It just opened its mouth, opening wider than should have been possible, revealing rows of ice crystal teeth, and bit down on Mackenzie's shoulder. His screams followed us into the darkness. I wanted to stop, wanted to fight, wanted to do something other than run like a coward while my team was torn apart. But Erik kept pulling me forward, kept the group moving, making the terrible calculation that some might survive if we kept moving, while all would die if we stopped. Father O'Connor fell next. I don't know if he tripped or if his heart simply gave out. One moment he was beside the sled, the next he was on the ice, not moving. Two of the creatures were on him instantly. I turned away before I could see what they did, but his prayers cut off with a liquid gurgle that will haunt me until I die. 4 of us left now. Erik, Margaret, Crawford, and myself. Lars was still with the dogs, somehow keeping them moving despite their exhaustion. We'd lost the second sled somewhere back there, lost most of our supplies. We had nothing but the clothes on our backs, 2 rifles, and a desperate will to survive. The creatures stopped chasing us. I felt it before I understood it, that terrible presence lifting from behind us. I risked another glance back and saw them standing in a line, watching us flee silhouetted against the aurora. They weren't following anymore. They were just watching, those terrible eyes gleaming in the darkness. Why did they stop? Margaret gasped. Erik's face was grim. Because they know we're dead anyway. We're too far from base camp. We don't have enough supplies. We'll freeze or starve long before we reach the coast. Then what do? I asked, though I already knew the answer. We keep moving. We move until we can't move anymore. And we pray that the cold takes us before they change their minds. We moved through that endless night, navigating by stars and compass and Erik's instincts. The dogs pulled until 3 of them collapsed in their traces, dying of exhaustion and cold. We left them where they fell. We had no choice. Every minute we stopped was a minute closer to freezing to death. Crawford stopped writing in his journal. His fingers had frozen, 3 of them black with frostbite. He tucked the journal into his coat against his chest, protecting it with his body heat, preserving his documentation of our nightmare. Margaret had stopped shivering, which terrified me more than if she'd been shaking uncontrollably. When shivering stops, hypothermia has reached critical stages. Dawn came eventually, that brief blue twilight that passes for daylight in the Arctic winter. In its light, I could see how bad our situation truly was. Erik's face was waxy, frostbitten on both cheeks and his nose. Lars's left-handed frozen solid, his fingers locked in position on the dog sled. Margaret's lips were blue, her movements sluggish. Crawford was the worst, stumbling like a drunk, his speech slurred with cold. We have to shelter, Erik said. Find some windbreak, get warm, or we die in the next few hours. We found shelter in the lee of an ice pressure ridge, a formation where plates of sea ice had collided and thrust upward, creating a wall that blocked the wind from the south. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give us a chance. Lars got a small stove working with hands he could barely control. The heat it produced was pathetic, barely enough to warm a cup of tea, but it was life itself in that frozen hell. Margaret worked on everyone's frostbite with supplies she'd somehow managed to keep. Her own face was damaged, black spots on her cheeks and nose where tissue had frozen and died, but she ignored her own injuries to tend to ours. Crawford's fingers were beyond saving. 3 of them would need to be amputated if we ever reached civilization. When she examined Lars's hand, her face went pale. "I can't feel anything below my wrist," Lars said calmly, his Norwegian accent thick with exhaustion. "It's dead, isn't it?" Margaret nodded slowly. "If we don't get you to a hospital within days, we'll lose the whole arm to gangrene." "Days." Lars laughed, a sound without humor. "We're weeks from anywhere. Face it, doctor. I'm a dead man who just doesn't know it yet." We rested there for 6 hours, taking turns sleeping while others kept watch. Not for the creatures. We hadn't seen them since that terrible chase. But for the cold itself, making sure no one drifted into the kind of sleep you don't wake from. I took the last watch, staring out at the Arctic waste while my companions breathed raggedly behind me. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was a mirage, my frost-damaged brain creating hopeful visions, but as I stared it remained solid, real smoke. Not much, just a thin dark line against the blue twilight, but unmistakable. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. I woke the others. We stared at that thin column of hope, afraid to believe, afraid it would vanish if we acknowledged it. Erik pulled out his compass with shaking hands, took a bearing. "Southwest," he said. "Maybe 10 kilometers, could be a hunting camp, could be Norwegian trappers, could be salvation, could be them," Margaret said quietly. "A trap." We all knew she was right. The creatures had demonstrated intelligence, had herded us, had played with us. There was no reason to think they couldn't light a fire if they wanted to draw us in. But what choice did we have? We were dead if we stayed here, would be dead in another day or 2 from exposure and starvation. At least the smoke offered a chance, however slim. "We go," I decided. "What's the worst that can happen? They kill us. We're dead anyway. At least we die trying to survive instead of just freezing in place." The trek to the smoke source took 8 hours. We only had 4 dogs left, barely able to pull the empty sled. We took turns riding and walking, those walking helping to push when the sled stuck in rough ice. The smoke grew larger, more substantial, and my heart began to dare hope. This was real. This was actually real. The camp emerged from the twilight like a miracle. 3 tents, Norwegian design, with a central fire pit and sleds lined up in proper Arctic order. But something was wrong. The camp was too quiet. No one emerged to greet us despite our shouts. The dogs didn't bark. Nothing moved. We approached cautiously, Erik and I with our rifles ready despite our frozen fingers barely able to grip them. The first tent was empty but recently occupied. Supplies still laid out, sleeping bags still arranged. The second tent was the same. The third tent made me understand why no one had greeted us. Bodies, 5 of them, Norwegian trappers by their equipment. They sat in a circle around a small stove, frozen in position, their faces locked in expressions of absolute terror. Their eyes were open, frost-covered, staring at the tent ceiling. They'd died looking at something that had terrified them so much they'd literally been scared to death. "Look at this," Crawford whispered, pointing at the tent wall with his ruined hand. The canvas was covered in scratch marks from the inside, long gouges where the trappers had tried to claw their way out. But the tent flap had been closed from the inside. They could have escaped. They chose to die in here rather than face what was outside. Margaret was examining the bodies with professional detachment, though I could see her hands shaking. No marks on them. No injuries I can see, they just died. Cardiac arrest from shock, maybe. All 5 of them, simultaneously. "We need to leave," Erik said flatly. "Right now. This is a killing ground. They're still here." But we were too late. I heard it first, that terrible vibrating scream resonating through the ice. Then I saw them, emerging from the twilight in a circle around the camp. More than before. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. An army of ice wraiths surrounding us, cutting off any escape. This time they didn't rush. They just stood there watching, waiting. One of them moved forward, taller than the others, something that might have been a leader if such creatures had leaders. It opened its mouth and made sounds that were almost words, syllables that hurt to hear, language that predated human speech or came from somewhere humans were never meant to go. Father O'Connor's journal had survived, tucked in Crawford's coat. I remembered the priest's words about the old stories about the ice gester. They were men once, he'd said, transformed by the ice, by the darkness. by staying too long in places humans weren't meant to be. They're trying to tell us something, I said. Trying to tell us we're going to die, Margaret replied. But I didn't think so. Looking at them, really looking, I saw something in their movements, their positioning. They weren't attacking. They were containing us, keeping us here. But why? We barricaded ourselves in the largest tent, knowing it would provide no real protection, but needing the psychological comfort of walls, however thin. The creatures maintained their circle, never moving closer but never leaving. They stood there through the hours, patient as glaciers, waiting for something. Lars was dying. The gangrene had spread from his frozen hand up his arm, black lines of infection visible through his skin. He drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering in Norwegian about his childhood, about his brother Erik, about the dogs. Margaret had given him the last of our medical morphine, but it wasn't enough to stop the pain or the infection ravaging his body. Erik sat beside his brother, holding his one good hand, his weathered face carved with grief he couldn't express. They spoke quietly in Norwegian, words I didn't understand, but whose meaning was clear in their tone. They were saying goodbye. Crawford was writing again, his ruined hand somehow still able to grip a pencil. He'd filled pages of his journal with drawings, descriptions, everything we'd witnessed. His handwriting grew progressively worse as frostbite and exhaustion took their toll, but he kept writing, driven by some need to document, to leave a record. "Why are you bothering?" Margaret asked him quietly. "No one will ever read that. We're not getting out of here." Crawford looked up at her with eyes that held a strange peace. "Someone might find it. Someday. Even if it's 100 years from now. They need to know what happened here. They need to know what's out there." He went back to writing. "Besides, it's what I do. I document. If I stop now, I've already given up. I've already let them win." I moved to the tent entrance, peering out through a small gap. The creatures hadn't moved. They just stood there, those terrible faces turned toward our tent, eyes reflecting the aurora light. I realized I could see them more clearly now, details I'd missed before. Their bodies weren't solid but seemed to shift, ice and flesh and something else merging and separating. In some places I could almost see through them to the ice beyond. In other places they looked solid as stone. "They're not entirely physical," I said aloud. Erik looked up from his brother. "What? Look at them. Really look, they're partly here and partly somewhere else. Between states, ice ghosts. That's what the stories called them, and it's true. They're trapped between being material and immaterial. Does that help us?" Margaret asked. "I don't know. Maybe. If they're not entirely solid. Maybe that's why bullets barely affected them. You can't shoot a ghost. But maybe it means they can't entirely affect us either. Maybe that's why they're waiting instead of just killing us." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. They'd killed Fletcher, McKenzie, Father O'Connor. They'd killed these Norwegian trappers. They could affect us just fine when they wanted to. Lars died near dawn. One moment he was breathing, ragged and painful, and the next he simply stopped. Erik closed his brother's eyes with steady hands, then stood and walked to the tent entrance. Before I could stop him, he pushed through the flap and stepped outside. "Erik." "No." I lunged for him, but Margaret held me back. "Let him go," she whispered. "He knows what he's doing." Erik stood in front of our tent, facing the creatures, his rifle hanging loose in one hand. He spoke in Norwegian, his voice carrying across the ice, addressing them directly. I couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear in his tone. He was challenging them, confronting them, demanding answers. The creatures didn't move. They just watched him stand there, this weathered Norwegian guide who'd spent his life in the Arctic, who understood ice and cold and survival better than anyone. He shouted at them, demanding response, demanding confrontation. Still they didn't move. Then Erik did something that stopped my heart. He dropped his rifle and began walking toward them. Not running, not charging, just walking with steady purpose toward the nearest creature. Margaret gasped beside me. Crawford stopped writing. We watched, unable to move, unable to breathe, as Erik closed the distance. He stopped directly in front of one of them, maybe 2 meters away. I could see his breath crystallizing between them. The creature towered over him, 8 feet of impossible anatomy, but Erik didn't flinch. He reached out slowly and touched it. His hand went through it like mist. But then the creature solidified, became solid under his touch, and Erik jerked back as if burned. He stumbled backward, looking at his hand. Even from the tent, I could see frost forming on his glove where he'd made contact, spreading up his arm. It showed me, Erik said when he stumbled back into the tent. His voice was strange, distant. When I touched it, it showed me. This is their territory, their domain. We violated it. We went where we shouldn't have gone, saw what we shouldn't have seen. The glacier we were mapping, the formations we documented, those aren't natural. This is their place, their construction. We mapped their home, their sanctuary. What do they want? I asked. They want us to forget, to never speak of what we saw, to make sure no one else comes here. His eyes focused on me, and they were full of terrible knowledge. They're going to let one of us go. One survivor to carry the warning. The rest of us stay here. Become part of the ice, join them. Margaret made a small sound of denial. Crawford's pencil fell from his frozen fingers. How do you know this? I demanded. Because they told me. When I touched it, it pushed into my mind. Showed me everything. They were explorers once, hundreds of years ago. Norse, maybe earlier. They went too deep, stayed too long. The ice claimed them, changed them. Now they protect it, keep others away. Anyone who comes too close, who sees too much, either dies or joins them. I won't accept that, I said. There has to be another way. There isn't. Erik's face was calm, resigned. I'm staying. Lars is already gone. I'll stay with my brother. You three draw lots for who leaves. We argued for hours, but Erik was immovable. He'd made his decision and nothing would change it. So finally, with hands that shook from more than cold, we drew. 3 pieces of cloth torn from our tent, 2 marked with Crawford's pencil, 1 left blank. Margaret drew first. Marked. Crawford drew second. Marked. That left me with the blank piece. The survivor, the one who would carry the warning. They gave me the strongest remaining dogs, the lightest sled, and what few supplies we could spare. Crawford pressed his journal into my hands, wrapped in waterproof canvas, bound with wire to protect it. Tell them, he said. His voice was weak, his frostbitten face barely able to move. Tell them what we found. Tell them not to come back here, ever. Margaret helped me prepare, checking my gear with professional thoroughness even though her own face showed advanced frostbite. Due south, she said. Don't stop, don't look back. If you maintain pace, you might reach the coast in 8 days. Maybe 9. I can't just leave you all here, I protested. You can and you will. Her voice was steel. Someone has to survive. Someone has to warn them. That's you now. Don't waste our sacrifice. Erik had already said his goodbyes, sitting beside his brother's body in the tent. When I went to him, he gripped my shoulder with his good hand. The ice takes what it wants, he said. Always has, always will. We knew the risks when we came. Just make sure no one else makes our mistake. The creatures parted as I approached with the sled, opening a path due south. They watched me pass with those terrible eyes, their faces expressionless, their bodies shifting between solid and translucent. I forced myself to look at them, to memorize every detail, knowing I'd need to describe them later, knowing this journal would be all the proof I had. I looked back once, just before they disappeared into the twilight. I saw Margaret and Crawford standing outside the tent, waving farewell. I saw Erik beside them, his arm around his brother's frozen form. And I saw the creatures closing in behind them, surrounding them, beginning whatever transformation would claim them. Then I faced forward and drove the dogs south. I didn't look back again. The journey back took 12 days. I should have died a dozen times, but somehow I kept moving. The dogs died one by one, but I kept moving. My fingers froze, my face cracked and bled, but I kept moving. Because 3 people had died so I could carry this warning, and I would not let them down. The whaling station appeared on the 13th day, smoke rising from its chimneys like a beacon of salvation. I stumbled into the main building, Crawford's journal clutched to my chest, and collapsed in front of men who stared at me like I'd returned from the grave. I told them everything. Showed them the journal, the photographs Crawford had managed to develop, the notes and drawings. Some believed. Most didn't. But they sent no rescue mission. No one went back from my team. The area was marked as hazardous, closed to future expeditions. I'm writing this in London, 3 months later. My hands are ruined, 4 fingers amputated, but I can still write. I can still warn. Don't go north of Svalbard. Don't seek the ice wraiths. Some places are meant to remain unmapped. Some doors should stay closed.